Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. The story I'm talking about today is episode 71 of my ongoing series, Worth 1,000 Words, where I write a 1,000 word short story inspired by a piece of artwork. And this week I did something a little bit experimental, not as experimental as I've done in the past, but it was a great learning experience. One that taught me that maybe sometimes you just need to stay in your own lane. But before I go on, let's talk about the music I listen to, because as you know, music is very inspiring to me. I never write without music. And I listen to Rafael Anton Irisarri's Sola Stagia. I think I got that right. Anyway, this piece, as you'll see, is very gray, very monochromatic, very stone-like, let's say. And Raphael does a lot of droning, interesting electronic mixed with strings, and so I knew it would be a great fit and hopefully put me in the right headspace for it. So let us check out this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled Human and is by an artist named Ji-Hoon Lee out of South Korea. This one almost is like a sculptural piece of artwork, I guess you could say. It has this focal point, this man at the center who is holding his head in his hands, and he is surrounded by a bunch of dead men. Looks like some of them have been run through by these pieces of wood that are just speared through this stone wall. And then, across the board, they kind of, their faces look like they're peeling. It almost looks like they're victims from some kind of explosion in a way. But the man at the center, he does not look like he's destroyed. He does look like he's made out of stone, though, so I'm not sure what's going on here. But this one, you can tell it's trying to be more of a metaphor than anything literal. So I think it's going to be a challenge to tell a story, but I just love the artwork so much I had to give it a shot. So Ji-Hoon Lee, thank you so much for this artwork. I look forward to exploring the rest of your portfolio. All right, let's see what I came up with. The light, gray softly, white partly. A form pulled from the wall. A bench. The shadow it cast looked inviting, almost enough to crawl into. And he wondered what was on the other side of that shadow, inside that shadow. Or did it end with a wall, all an illusion, a cold, hard space? He contemplated that space and who might have used it as shelter, dove into it, existed through it. He thought he would sit, listen to their tales, feel it in the stone, maybe tell some of his own, though his weren't interesting. And no one answered. He took comfort in what he could, alone. Alone wasn't comforting. He smiled when he heard it. Voices, footsteps, laughing, sighing. He smiled when he saw it. Faces to keep him company, to share this spot, for there was plenty of room, endless room. They didn't ask to sit, piling around him, left and right, some even finding their spots on the ground, using the bench as a back to the chair that was the ground. "Nice to meet you," one said. Then he realized he wasn't talking to him. His attention was beyond, directed at someone sitting beside him, and he was fine with that. The conversation, the laughter, the breath that smelled of old breakfast and coffee, quantum particles taking every possible path, colliding with what they sought or didn't. He was caught in the middle, a screen that they flowed through, all but a few. At least that was the explanation he told himself. Why he felt something at the back of his throat, an itch he tried to reach with his tongue, but it migrated to the back of his skull before he could scratch it, holding there, waiting. For what? He waited for them, patiently. The faces that looked everywhere, at the street, at each other, at the sky, at the wall. It was loud, this existence he found himself in. An observer only, and he found himself confronted only with white noise. "Hello," he said, thinking if he spoke, maybe they'd hear, and he was sure to enunciate clearly, evenly, and directly. The one closest to him smiled and nodded, almost caught his gaze before it slipped away to somewhere else, someone else. He felt the loss in his teeth, and he thought it was the pain at the back of his skull, leaping out to taunt him, to see if he would chase it. It wasn't. It was something else, something new. He clamped his teeth down to catch it, or to ignite it. It did have the spirit of flame, writhing, searching for something to help it grow. He felt like he had discovered something, a fact that no one around him knew, and he was happy again in his solitude among the rabble. "Hello," he said to his hands, but those immediately went to the back of his head in response, massaging that spot at the base of his skull that suddenly hurt so bad. He closed his eyes to concentrate on it, to visualize its shape, color, size, so that he could grab hold of it, take control of it, mold it into what he needed it to be. "What do I need it to be?" he said. To his surprise, the one to his right looked at him, acknowledged him as if he were more than a smudge on the wall that had been there for years, a stain. "That doesn't make any sense," the right one said. "Here, let me explain." Right one said all manner of thing, until his words divided into letters, then to meaningless sounds, then to nothing at all but white noise. "It does make sense," he said, hands on the back of his head again while he worked his jaw to kick the hornet's nest that grew there beneath the enamel, beneath the gum line. He thought that would have been enough to respond, to assert himself. But when he turned to address right one, he was faced away, spewing his sounds onto someone else. And that someone else appeared pleased with the sounds, open mouth smiling with attentive fascination. He felt a bump on his knee and looked down to see another pushing him aside. "Can you move over a little?" this one asked. But instead of waiting for a response, he turned to someone else, firmly planted in his new spot, which used to belong to him and him alone, back when there was plenty of room to think, to feel, to exist. The sensation in his jaw broke through the flesh and met the other at the back of his skull. There they intermingled, and he watched with his eyes closed because it was the only way he could see. Others throttled him apologetically, until his seat on the bench had been whittled down to a sliver. He envisioned that sliver as a physical object, sharp and indestructible. It had to be to finish what needed to be done. He drew it back, an arrow, a sword, a bullet, unleashed it. Ignition, so quick, so silent, no ringing in his ears. They lay around him, sat around him, in heaps. He liked that word. It had impact, much like the spears had, that drove through the stone walls to find flesh, to find an end. Quantum particles finding every possible path, and every path was right. The pain was gone, the sounds were gone, the smells. He didn't mind the one on the ground, lifeless head using his knee as a pillow. He didn't mind the right one, lounging against him as a friend. It was an illusion, like the space beneath the bench, which he no longer sought, because he had his own space in beautiful solitude, which he had missed. He didn't look up to see the others, preferring the view of the ground, the area between his feet, which was vast and calm, gray softly, white partly, so right. This one was tough, as I thought. I think inherently, like I was just the imagery itself, while completely compelling, it is, as I said, sculptural. There's so many possibilities, which you'd think would make storytelling a little bit easier because I can grasp onto something and just go with it. But in the case of this one, I had a few different things going through my head, and I think the first one was that, yeah, this guy was the guy at the center was sort of the impetus of the destruction around him. He was the cause of it. And that's what I ended up doing. But I was really going back and forth quite a bit in terms of like, and I think I was really thrown off by the clothing of everybody because it doesn't feel modern in any sense. I'm sure it's cultural, but I didn't grasp that right away. And I think one thing that's interesting too is it also looks like I think it's all males. There could be a female on the left side there. It's tough to tell. That was something that was running through my head quite a bit as well. Like, what would be the point of that? Like, why is that? What does that mean? And so what I went with, as I said, is sort of this guy who was, he set off he came into this world, this quote unquote world, and he was at first happy. He was kind of looking around, and again, there's really not much here to look at: the street, the wall, the bench. And then he became lonely, I guess. And then he was at first happy when the world was populated. And then he wasn't into it for very long, and so decided to just destroy it and go back to the way things were in this gory display. So I think that is probably, I'll talk about this in less detail, but that's what this part's for, the more detail, is that, this entire thing, it's metaphor, right? I don't know what the artist was going for. I mean, with a title like Human, I can only imagine maybe human destruction, human loneliness, I don't know, something like that. That's kind of what I was getting from this. And that is the downside, honestly, from my perspective in storytelling, is that you can capture things like this symbolically in artwork, but then when you write it, you can do the same thing, but I prefer stories that are visual, that aren't just steeped in confusing imagery. I try to do that anyway. So I feel like this one here, just for me, it didn't really work very well, only because I like stories that have emotional impact. I like stories that have character, and I don't feel like this story was about character whatsoever, because the artwork seems to be representing an idea or a concept of some kind. It was difficult for me to create that human story, I guess. I know, bad choice of words, but yeah, it's true. And so the story itself is kind of pretentious, kind of lacking. I felt like it's not pretentious in a good way, right? I feel like that there's something there. There's definitely like a progression. There's a conflict. There's a realization. There's all the things I think that you want in a story, but it was lacking any kind of meaningful character work, and I think that's part of the failing of it, in my opinion. And that's okay. I think this was just an experiment. Like I have another experiment I'd like to do, and I talked about it a long time ago, and it could be a complete miss, but it's to take an environment, take a room, let's say, and create a story from that. Just again, like the whole point of this is to try different things without spending too much time on it. And so this one was my pretentious take. It was trying to get the meaning, or assume the meaning of this artist and put it to words, and sort of create just like I said, the conflict, the resolution, the problem, the turn of the scene, and so on and so forth. And what I really learned from this, and what it taught me, is that storytelling, for me anyway, it's what you see in your mind's eye. Okay. I know a lot of times writing in general can veer from that. It can be, and I've done that myself too, where it may be difficult to understand what's going on. It may be more of a telling story rather than a showing story. But those aren't really that's not the kind of storytelling I enjoy. I enjoy picturing something unfolding before my eyes, to where that these places truly exist, these people really exist, and what kind of messes they can get themselves into, essentially. And this one just really wasn't there. I still have the artwork. I think the artwork's amazing. I love the fact it's just this monochromatic depiction of all these people who have been destroyed, and I think it does really speak volumes, right? And I think this is where, like I said earlier, is artwork has its own strengths, and I think that is very apparent in this one. You can see someone who's clearly, distraught at the center of the image, and then all of the death around him. So this could mean so many different things. I know I'm all over the place, but I think that when you're taking an image and you're telling a story, sometimes that story can be more interesting than the image. I think a written story has a certain power of its own as well, just like art does. Art does too, and I think in this case, art won, because this is the kind of image that you maybe don't really want to know the story behind it. You want to just kind of take in the visuals, take in the composition, and just let that be the sole emotion, or let that sort of create the emotion for you, rather than you trying to spell something out. And I think that it's an interesting concept, because I think every discipline has its own strengths and its own weaknesses, right? Writing, music, art, film, they all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses. And I think this was a good one for me, because it showed me sort of like where I needed to, at least in my personal tastes, right? I think there's plenty of writers who could take something like this and really weave something together interesting. It would be, probably as deep or as intricate as the artwork itself. Whereas, because I tend to gravitate towards things that are more accessible, but do have layers of depth. But again, it's still a traditional story. It's entertaining, at least to the best of my ability. That's what I like to create. That's what I like to read. I completely respect writers or artists who are trying to say something, but I think those messages should be hidden within very accessible language and storytelling, right? Because you want people to enjoy what you read. I don't want people to read my stories with sort of like a magnifying glass and thinking of it as a learning experience. I don't want that whatsoever. I want someone to have some kind of emotional reaction to it. Whatever emotion that may be. I think that's, again, Saul Stein, I've said this countless times. Yeah, that's how he defines fiction. It's designed to evoke emotion, and that's really stuck with me. Way back when it was one of the first writing books I ever read, and maybe that's why. But that's what I always try to go for. So less of this, highbrow kind of metaphorical symbolism. It has its place. It's just not for me. It's not my taste. I like somewhere in the middle. I like something accessible yet deep, right? I feel like when you get too deep, you kind of just lose things, because if no one wants to read your work, then it doesn't matter what you're trying to say. So I think it's always important to make it as accessible as possible. On a good note, this one only took me, I think, about an hour to finish. So it wasn't a long writing session. It was quick. But, lots of learning, happened in this one. But I went with it. I wrote about 2 paragraphs, and then I was kind of like, yeah, I shouldn't have picked this one. But, I saw it through because that's what I got to do, right? I can't quit on these things. As much as I've wanted to quit on more than one, a few, you got to see to the end, because sometimes you never know. It might turn around. It might turn into something interesting. It might turn into something you're proud of. And so I just take it to the end. But only about 10 minutes left here to get to the end. And I'm already at 1,000 words, just under an hour. Now it's cleanup time. I think I have the overall structure of everything, but I was just trying to clean up the language a little bit, make it flow a little bit better. I don't know. It's funny, even though I'm not very happy with the story, it just, something about this image makes me want to take another stab at it, try it again, because I think there's something there I could find. Maybe someday. I don't know. Maybe it'll hit me one day. Usually when I do have an idea, it hits me immediately after I finish the story, and then I want to go back and write it. Not with this one, but who knows? I'm sure this one will be lurking in the back of my mind for a long time, because it is a very powerful image, and one that I'll definitely probably return to. And I'm excited to see the rest of the artist's work too. And about to wrap it up. 7 more words to go. Add these toward the end. I stripped away quite a bit early on, and so again, trying to create the great last line, or at least as great as I could. So what I did is I just repeated that phrase from the beginning. Welcome to the end, dear viewer. I'm so glad you made it. This is where I talk about my final thoughts, what I liked, what I didn't like, maybe what I learned. And honestly, there isn't much that I liked about this story. I think the only thing was that I did have the structural elements there. I had sort of a day in the life. I had a scene turn, I had conflict, etc. I had a resolution. So I guess that's the one good thing about it, because I know that last week I didn't quite get there. I felt like I left the story just kind of hanging. There were some other interesting pieces to it, but it never really went anywhere. This story did go somewhere, but it wasn't very interesting to me. And I think it's because this piece of artwork is trying to tell something. It's trying to make a statement. It is trying to be a metaphor for something else. And while you can easily do metaphor in story, I mean, you do metaphor all the time on a line-by-line basis, but I think a story as a whole can be a metaphor. This is one of those instances where maybe the artwork itself is a better representation of whatever message that author or the artist was trying to convey. Detailing it out, as I do in a story, putting a narrative around it, introducing characters, was probably not the best way to go about it. So this is one of those situations where I think that this exists best in artwork. And I talk about this in the writing, but every medium of creativity has its strengths and its weaknesses. And in this one, I believe art is stronger than the written word, at least in my execution of it. I'm sure there are plenty of better writers out there who could have turned this into something great, but alas, I did not. So while I'm glad I did tackle something different, I enjoyed doing that, and I will continue to do that, because I think doing the same thing day in and day out just kind of gets a little repetitive. And so It's moments like these that I choose to challenge myself, and you don't always succeed, but you come away from it with new knowledge that you can take into your next works. I'll keep this one short. I don't think there's really much else to discuss other than the fact that sometimes the image is more powerful than the word, and I think in my case anyway, what I created here, that is a fact. So if you'd like to support the channel, give me a like if you liked the video, subscribe for story-related content. Check out my book if you haven't already. It's pretty new. Came out in December. So it hasn't been out very long. People seem to enjoy it. I have a good average review score, not many reviews. So if you have read it, and you did like it or didn't like it even, please give me a review on Amazon. I'd really appreciate it. And now I'm off to record a book review. Yes, I've been meaning to do this. It's a great book. So probably come out tomorrow. Keep an eye out for that. And on that note, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.